Jesus said in Matthew 5:19, "Do and teach God's law." This is God's law number 24. Obey the judge or die. Hello, everybody. Welcome. This is Jim McCotter. Here is God's law number 24 from God's law book of Deuteronomy. It's Deuteronomy 17, verse 11 through 13. Quote, "After they have interpreted the law and declared their verdict, the sentence that they impose must be fully executed. Do not modify it in any way. Anyone arrogant enough to not obey the verdict of the judge, who represents the Lord your God, that person must be put to death. In this way you will purge the evil from the nation. Then all the people will hear about it and be afraid to act so arrogantly again." End quote. This law has amazing benefits for a nation, but of course it also goes without saying the judge must be a man that is just in following God's law. If judges go bad, so goes the nation. That's why in God's law it instructs three things. One, parents and grandparents to teach their children and grandchildren God's law. That's in Deuteronomy chapter 4, and Deuteronomy chapter 6. Number 2, the top civil leaders read God's law daily. Deuteronomy 17, 18 through 20. And number 3, God's law is to be publicly read every 7 years to the whole nation. Deuteronomy chapter 31, 10 through 13. We see God's law continue to be publicly read in the New Testament. Acts 13:15 and verse 27, and chapter 15 and verse 21 and 31. And the Apostle Paul also instructed Timothy to publicly read God's law. 1 Timothy chapter 4:13. To do this in the church. Quote, "Until I come, devote yourself to the public reading of Scripture." End quote. At that time, it was God's law and the Old Testament that was always and only referred to as Scripture. How many churches today are following Paul's instruction to be devoted in the public reading of God's law? God's judges. With a nation under God's law, quote, "the judges represent the Lord your God," end quote. That is significant, and that is why to not obey their civil verdict is to not obey God. And to not obey God is death. This is the one law of God that makes it possible for a nation to never need any prisons. In all God's law, there are only two categories for justice to be carried out. Number 1, capital punishment for capital crimes. And number 2, one-time immediate punishment or a restitution of some sort. We're looking at these as we continue through Deuteronomy. Therefore, in following God's law, there was no need for prisons. Furthermore, with this law, a nation did not even need a standing police force to enforce a judge's sentence. If, for example, the verdict was to pay back double what was stolen, and they act so arrogantly to not obey the judge who represents the Lord, it then becomes a capital crime. There was to be no revolving doors with criminals, and this law would do more to instantly rehabilitate any criminal than some smart person in the 19th century that thought up the idea of modern-day prison system today that we have to, quote, "rehabilitate a criminal by living with criminals." Amazing how stupid some non-Christians can become. Romans 1:22 says, claiming to be wise, they become utter fools. 1 Corinthians 15:33 says, "Don't be fooled by those who say such things, for bad company corrupts good character." End quote. If God's law is not embraced, what is the alternative? Innocent people, not to speak of the victims, would now have to be slaves in working for their criminals for the rest of their lives and paying for criminals free board and room and all their other amenities. Over $80 billion is spent annually for prisons in the United States. That's a crime and continual punishment to all victims and innocent people. Prisons are another of man's unjust, stupid, and unbiblical law. The only people who would argue against this law for judges would be the criminals or those perverted enough to support criminals.